Chapter 8 Captivity Day 15 Temple Complex Meeting Hall. Praetorian, there have been far too many problems since that woman arrived. From her tracking anklet, we know she was the one that visited Lady Darkseid. Unfortunately, the video and audio from inside the room was corrupted. We suspect the involvement of a cyberpath. There's been nothing new posted under the Shadowfac ID since the Nadrock video. Our security data staff were unable to trace the hack, but they've isolated the vulnerability and are monitoring it for further incursions until we locate the breach, Jack said over the video screen. Your assistance is appreciated, Vershana said. As always, Jack snickered, your money is appreciated. Vershana disconnected the call with Jax and looked around the meeting table. Is there anything useful in the shift logs? Vershana asked the room. I don't know about useful, Ruka shrugged. The visitor asked if she wanted to escape, but our guest refused. The report indicates the desire to find out about the exile before considering an escape attempt. There were also references made to soul stones and a pet darkling. Make sure she doesn't, Vershana insisted. Yes, Prefect, Lilac said firmly, I will. Not too much, Shugga croaked. I've had limited success getting information directly from our guest, but she has requested an audience with the Xenon. I told her I'd pass it on. Find out why and report back, Vershana said irritably. A robed Lupian in the corner of the room spoke up, did you find her rock fragments yet? What rocks? Ruka asked. There's nothing in the reports. Find them, the Lupian growled. I don't care how, but they must be found. We could have the confinement area searched while I take her to visit one of the public baths. It's starting to get a bit rank in there, Lilac noted. Last time she got outside the ring, Cletheria attacked the Fellowship, Ruka sneered. I'll provide a psionic suppressor, Vershana said. Take her off the valid list, for now. If she tries anything, you know what to do. The meeting continued for 3 more hours. Kali. They'd brought electric lanterns into the chamber and patched the hole in the wall yesterday. Yesterday had little meaning without being able to see the sky. Days on planet and galactic standard days. Without being able to see the sky, she could only judge the passage of time by the meals she was fed, which wasn't enough. The day-night cycle on Arosha was vastly different than Corrales Standard Time. Now that she could check the Information Society news feed, she could verify one of her suspicions. The shifting colors of the buildings were intended to help visitors keep track of Standard Time. The glowing squares on the top corners of the skyscraper brightened and darkened to indicate the passage of galactic standard days. However, one rotation of the planet took more than a single standard day. Judging by the date on the IS feed, her 15th day of captivity had started less than an hour ago, which meant the Darkling should be leaving with that invisible girl sometime today. The contents of those stones were somehow connected to her sister's soul. The Darkling could have come back to get more, but there was a wisdom in only taking a quarter of the stones at once. If the ship were destroyed, inspected, or boarded, it could result in a significant loss. This mitigated the risks involved. The stones returned by the Darkling were now cold and dark. The creature wouldn't do anything that would endanger its queen. That much she was sure of. She wanted it to find Syntholo, and let someone know what had happened. She didn't fully understand the significance of the stones. They seemed to glow more after a few hours walking around town with them. Maybe they charged by being around people, but if that was the case, why were those 5 stones dark? Kali perused the available news stories. Kali was confident her selections were being monitored. She limited her actual searches and spent more time looking for individual articles. She didn't see any recent news from Curzon Space. The only reports pertaining to the Echelon system were announcements that the start of their annual arena combat competition was expected to be delayed by 2 weeks. If Gao Run had fulfilled her personal requests, the psychic training rig should have been delivered to the E2 a week ago, and Grax should arrive in the Echelon system soon, if he hadn't already. The conflict in Fellowship space was the prevailing news story, which was no surprise. The galaxy's favorite scapegoat was actually doing something for a change. This was just the natural consequence of the actions of the Loctarian government. There was no mention of Jake or Tiki in the news, nor was there likely to be. Once they were prepared to boast that Jake had been brought to justice, the very government that had made him a criminal would be praised for bringing their own creation to justice. Kali had seen Cletheria fight, but the footage on the news didn't match up. Without a queen at the center of their collective, their movements weren't properly synchronized. The Horde was vulnerable, but you wouldn't know that from the news reports. This was being promoted as the start of a second Cletherian rampage. The war that never really happened. Cletheria had attacked 2 systems, but the other 12 were attacked by the factions of the era, while Cletheria was given the dubious credit for genocidal conflicts they were uninvolved with. The most numerous species within the Mind Hive were the Clethar, which evolved from Loctarians. If they harmed Tiki, their nation would fall. She went there, with Jake, to help their insectal brethren. Kali had cautioned them. Unfortunately, she was right. Taz Corp was starting to get involved. Cletheria had taken full control of the Pilthgate, which had neutered the corporation's shipping schedule, throwing the entire galactic economy into chaos. Gamaro Inc. simply didn't have the infrastructure to pick up the slack. Several smaller companies were doing what they could to fill the gaps, but the problem with a single organization becoming the backbone of commerce was having a heavy toll. It was an interesting conundrum. If the factions united to defeat Cletheria, they'd need a new scapegoat, and risk drawing the Weavers into the conflict. No Weavers meant no Nax, which would be catastrophic for PRI and the Black Church, and allow for the spread of the Xenon, which would hinder passage through asteroid-rich regions. That would hinder mining needed for ship production. If the Gorgalians mobilized on a large scale, that would provide an opening for the expansion of other regional powers. The only viable option would be to sit back and let the Acrididae dynasty fall, but that would weaken the Midnight Fellowship and possibly lead to the collapse of a formidable neutral power, the nation responsible for defending a full third of galactic supply lines. And they control the other Stargate. This rather dire situation could be beneficial to Def Corp in the long run, but in the short term it could help with her plans for the Karzon. The mercantile marines would prosper in the chaos as well. As long as the IS could control the narrative, they'd come out on top. Until the consequences of Lawbarth's failure to predict events in Dareth space came to light and the other Cletherian queen led the Exthulian species on a genocidal war that would make the supposed Cletherian rampage look like a tea party. The Kaylani Dominion was involved in most peace negotiations, so any resolution they were involved with would bolster their reputation. This entire situation was a mess. If she could assume her place at the core of the hive mind, the conflict in Fellowship space could be resolved in days if not hours. Unfortunately, that would require knowledge only possessed by her sister self. Her little visitor had done a great job with her mystrionic water knife power to cut a narrow wedge in the floor tiles. The seams were hard to spot even when you knew where to look. 3 standard days had passed since then, but Kali hadn't even attempted to move the stones and deactivate the suppression ring. Her caretakers seemed too suspicious. Paranoid people were better at noticing small details. She hoped they'd find a way for her to meet with some Xenon. Preventing another incident could serve her purposes and theirs. For Shauna had once advised her sister self to abandon notions of good and evil in favor of an understanding that such notions were contingent upon whether or not their objectives aligned with your own. All they needed was a mutually beneficial realignment. Kali laid on one of the couches staring at the holographic tree and listening to the news while waiting for breakfast. Section break. Lilac strolled into the chamber beyond the containment area with Shuguk following right behind her, carrying a tray. "Good morning, Kali," Lilac said as they continued forward. A soft echo reverberated through the room whenever they spoke. If she listened carefully, Kali could almost hear them talk among themselves. Just a stray word here and there, but it was something. Is it? Kali asked. It's hard to tell in here. Good is meaningless here. They walked to the edge of the force field and waited for her to take her position in the middle of the room, lowered the field, stepped inside, and raised it. No guards today, Kali quipped as she stepped out of the tree hologram. I have some questions for you, Lilac said. I hope we can skip the game this time. Shugek put down the tray on the table near the couch. Why would I do that? Kali asked. Wait, Shugek cautioned, that was her first question. Answer carefully. Lilac nodded slowly. Kali grinned happily. They were learning. We all had a meeting about your request to speak with Xenon representatives, Lilac said. I've been instructed to ask you why. Shugek chuckled softly, if I'm right that incomplete question doesn't count. It was part of an answer. Correct, Kali smiled warmly. If this keeps up, I may have to add a no coaching rule. Your question. Why do you want to meet with the Xenon? Lilac asked. Peace talks, Kali shrugged. I was hoping Mistress Kaylani would be willing to sit in. I don't think that's going to happen, Shugek remarked. He knew the game well enough by now to understand he was just volunteering the information, but in the process, he was baiting for a question. Fine, I'll bite, Kali sighed. Which isn't going to happen, and why? Isn't that 2 questions? Lilac asked. Shugek answered. I think so. She might be encouraging a longer answer. Kali nodded, then sat down and started to eat. You've been declared a security risk, Lilac shrugged. We are currently looking into the possibility of setting up a meeting with the Xenon. Lady Darkseed, Shugek said in a formal tone, I'd like to request we suspend the game so I can ask you some questions about your care. Kali took a sip of juice then told him to go ahead and ask. Most of the questions pertained to how much and how often she was being fed, if she was comfortable, if they resumed drone feeding and scheduled personal feeding visits to free up their own schedules, and then moved on to if the bodily waste considerations were adequate. It was clear they had no intentions of releasing her. Kali struggled to control her emotions, as they began asking what they could do to make her more comfortable in her living area. The barrage of questions could be a test to see if they could provoke her to violence. She refused to give them the satisfaction. Lilac and Shugek were a good pair if the intention was to set her up. Kali had spent some of her time with monitor control looking up Shega and Zil racial traits. Shega were naturally able to sense danger, and Zil could sense the use of knacks and were empathic. These sorts of abilities worked within the suppression field, so Kali needed to keep her emotions under control, and her temper most of all. I ask permission to bring you to one of the public baths while we clean and adjust your confinement area, Kali interjected. Living arrangements, Shugek countered. Kali smirked, we'll be opening the sky view once we're done refitting your area, Lilac said. We'll be moving your weapons into storage outside of the ring, Shugek said. We're required to request that you consent to this. I can make sure they're where you can see them. Either the building or the force field blocked all incoming and outgoing communication. If Kali were in their position, she'd have Tyrell check all communications made after exiting the area, so she assumed they would do the same. It would be an easy task for a cyberpath. She'd just have to keep an eye out for one while she's out. Being careful with her wording was essential. I'll consent to the weapons and the bath, Kali said irritably, but I have a few conditions. Go ahead, Lilac said suspiciously. I've been wearing this armor since I arrived. I want you to install a soaking tub in my cell. Also give me a locker or something with drawers. I'd like to buy myself something else to wear. We can provide you with. No, Kali insisted, I want to pick them out and pay for them myself. People buy things. They make choices. Sure, you let me decide a few things about my holding pen, but that's making the animal comfortable in captivity. I just want to feel like a person for a single day. I don't think that's too much to ask. You're going to have to wear headgear that will suppress your psionic abilities, Lilac said. That's non-negotiable. The prefect won't permit it otherwise. Let them know I'll be wanting to talk with them at some point as well, Kali said. It sounds reasonable to me, Shugik said. When are you going to tell me what did they do to Syntholo? Kali asked with a smile. I can't answer that. Is there anything else? Lilac rolled her eyes. I'll get back to you on that, Kali grinned, if I come across anyone while I'm out who could help with satisfying a rather particular need. We seem to have an agreement, Lilac said. Just don't count on that last bit. I had to try, Kali shrugged. Can we hold off on leaving until after I've had my midday jog? Sounds reasonable, Shugik said while looking to Lilac. Lilac hesitantly agreed. They left with the tray and dishes. Deciding on how to frame a message that wouldn't raise suspicions took Kali quite some time. It wasn't until halfway through her run that she finally decided how to handle it. They were going to move her weapons beyond her reach, despite knowing she couldn't use them while her telepathy was inactive. Something had changed. Had La Barth made another one of his predictions? Maybe her short, most likely lamentic, visitor had spooked them. Syntholo seemed to think the combined might of the Kaylani Dominion and the Midnight Fellowship could rival that of the Lamentic Empire, yet he said their mutual defense pact was tenuous. Were treaties with the Fellowship valid when the faction had broken into its constituent parts due to a regional conflict? They didn't know who her Tejmare was, just that she's a Lamentic. Kali didn't know how to interpret the branches fully, but she could make enough sense of it to cause problems for the old Lupian. Living in and responding to the present, while taking lessons from the past seemed more reasonable than trying to sculpt the future to fit your own petty desires. There was a certain ebb and flow to it all. She could almost feel it. Whatever the future had in store for her, she'd face it as it came. In shadows the tree does sigh, preparing for its day to die, Kali chuckled to herself. She composed a single message to Tyrell and decided to rely on him to understand her actual intent and handle things as best as he could. Tyrell, it's been a while. I'd love to tell you how much I'm enjoying my vacation, but I'm not sure when I'll be able to make time to contact you again. I need you to pass along the proper spelling of Jake and Tiki's names, but I know how you get when I jump in with demands without touching base first. Give the kids my love. I'm not like Gowrie. I can't just fly my way home on a whim. On a more serious note, I heard about your daughter being detained. I'm sure it's been stressful for you and Pinky. Take care of each other. Kali had 15 stones from the old queen's chamber, 5 of which were dark. Bringing them with her wasn't an option. They'd be discovered when she disrobed for the bath. She left the 5 dark stones on the table and put 5 glowing stones in each tail pocket with the intention of stashing them around the city for the Darkling to seek out later. Keeping them in clusters would be preferable. Lilac showed up before she finished her daily run. The transmission was sent shortly after they left the building together. One of these days, she would have to thank Cyan for getting her a comms unit that looked like jewelry. I'm feeling a bit off, Kali complained. I know I'm supposed to wear this thing on my head, but I use my mental abilities to balance the other two. Would it be okay if I took it off just long enough to center myself? I can't allow that, Lilac said. I'd prefer to not have an armed escort. Kali glanced back at the ghostly halos around the heads of the 4, presumably armed, guards who were following behind them while using Cloak of the Unnoticed. With her Elderani eyes, she could see trails of blue energy connecting each of them with Lilac. They were all in a telepathic link, able to freely thinking to each other. With Kali's psionics disabled, she couldn't surreptitiously listen in. It said as much about how much Lilac was being trusted as it did about their concerns about allowing Lady Darkseid out of her cage. Are you sure? Kali said with a playful grin. I'll even tell you how to bypass the usual 5-person maximum link size if you do. Why would I want to know that? Lilac scoffed. Kali held up her fingers in a V-shape, then motioned over her shoulder toward the telepaths with her thumb. I can't imagine why. Those eyes of yours, Lilac grumbled. How much can you really see? It'll be harder where there's more current, but it's a bit secluded out here, Kali shrugged. I could show you, but I'd like a guarantee those 4 aren't going to do anything stupid. Of course, they'll drop their cloaks the second they do. They're not going to do anything, Lilac smirked. Really? Kali snickered, then why are they repositioning? The 2 in the middle spread out and the ones on either side are still circling. I'm guessing you have a couple snipers keeping an eye on me too, but they're not in the link. If you're going to keep playing games, I'd rather just sit in my cell. She turned her back to Lilac and strode back toward the building entrance. Her message had already been sent, the rest wasn't high on her priority list. Wait, Lilac said urgently as she rushed after her. No, Kali said as she pulled off the headband and tossed it over her shoulder, I'm done with this game. Kali shivered slightly as her consciousness spread outward. She felt her twin tails connecting to the closest weavers. One was near the Higag cluster, the other was in Fellowship space. Her black tail squirmed under her armored skirt, searching for a third. She heard the quartet of telepaths walking into the room as Lilac rushed past her. Using the blue trails of their telepathic link with Lilac as a guide, Kali held up her hands above her head and pointed at each of the telepaths without turning around to look. I know you're there. Stop fooling yourselves. It was unlikely she could defend against all 4 if they coordinated their efforts, but they were obviously following orders like mindless. She felt one of them emerge from their shroud as they tried to peer into her mind. Kali stopped walking, swung her black tail out behind her and pointed at the offender with her stinger. Care to try that again? Kali focused on her memory of her time in that defective medical cryogenic pod and dropped her defenses completely. The idiot took the bait. Kali giggled as Lilac froze in place. The memory was being shared through the link. All 5 of them were trapped in a memory that spanned thousands of years, and were now all fully visible. Well, that was stupid, she muttered. What should I do now? There were 4 round chambers connected to the containment area. She could explore a little while they watched her on thermal sensors, risk having a night on the town alone and see how many people would use her for target practice, or... Kali sighed as she coiled her tail back around her waist and stared at the fingertips of her left hand. I need to break the link, Kali grumbled. Stunning her might work. She glanced down at the headband in Lilac's hand. Even better. Kali applied pressure to Lilac's wrist while gently loosening her death grip on the psionic suppressor. After liberating the device, she loosened the band and carefully fastened it around the woman's head. What was? Lilac stammered. I'll explain on the way to the store, Kali said as she stepped behind and guided her confused jailer past the telepaths, toward the exit. I assumed they were using a telepathic link, Kali said. I called that wrong. It was bond, not link. That allows participants to share all sensory input, not just thoughts. It was a bad call on their part. What happened? Lilac said dreamily. You'll be fine in a couple minutes, Kali said as she guided her through the door. One of them looked in my head and didn't find what they expected. What was that? Kali spun Lilac around so they could see the look in each other's eyes. I was badly injured when I was a child. I was put in a cryogenic healing pod. It mended my injuries, but never let me out. I was trapped in there for over 40,000 years. I was conscious, immobile, unable to age or die. Confinement, in the dark, is torture to me. I'm sure you remember the night I dreamed about the day I was injured. I do, Lilac said softly as her eyes started to clear. When they looked in my mind, that's the memory they found. They'll be stuck in it for a while. How long? I don't know, Kali shrugged. I got you out using that headband. Lilac put her hands on either side of her head. Oh, you're supposed to wear this. Leave it, Kali said as she stopped her from removing it. I'm not sure what will happen if you take it off so soon. It will at least keep me out of your head. Lilac shook her head and shivered. Do yourself a favor, Kali said softly. In the future, stick with links. Bonds have their uses, but can cause problems. I really should go get them. No, Kali said, you should take me shopping and to that bathhouse. Lilac looked conflicted. They didn't try to read my surface thoughts, Kali said. They tried looking deeper without my consent. Now they're dealing with the consequences of their actions. In the Kailani Dominion, are natural consequences for violating personal autonomy subject to administrative review? Lilac lowered her head. She looked like she was feeling shame, but Kali couldn't be sure while the woman was wearing the headband. Kali placed 2 fingers under the woman's chin and angled her head upward. Your leaders can sort out which of your telepaths violated your consent laws later. You're not a psionicist. I know you're not at fault. Unless you ordered them to try to dig into my mind. You didn't do that, did you? I did not, Lilac confirmed. Kali smiled warmly. Good, let's get started. I need to call this in to appraise our people of the situation, Lilac said in an even tone. Kali took a quick look around and noticed a fountain to one side of the building. I'll go sit over there to give you some privacy. While Lilac was explaining the situation, Kali used her twin tails to secretively dump the softly glowing stones into the bottom of the fountain, and hide them under the small rocks at the bottom. The afternoon went fairly smoothly after that. Kali was acutely aware she was being watched. Her combat empathy was triggered a few times, and it was a conscious effort not to react. The clothes shopping was strangely challenging. How could she send a covert message to Tyrell, who was likely to monitor her purchase history? He had passively monitored everything that happened on the Regicide one, and she was grateful for it. In addition to more standard purchases, she made a point of buying vanilla orchid body wash, a mid-thigh height red and black plaid skirt and red knee socks, and lacy pink underwear. With any luck, Tyrell would catch the reference to the most traumatizing day she had on the ship. The panties weren't even close to the Cayman season, which properly suited her biology. They were more like boxers. That should get his attention. She'd have to cut a hole in the back to accommodate her tails. Just in case he shared the information with her Tejmare, Kali purchased high heels and a pair of running shoes. She talked Lilac into letting her stop by a jeweler, where she purchased a set of cuff bracelets. One for each wrist, and one for each ankle. Her chaperone seemed hesitant until Kali explained what she wanted, then praised her for her choice. Judging from the look in the short woman's eyes, there was more to Lilac's sexuality than she initially admitted. It was hard to decide if she was being treated like a dangerous prisoner, a visiting dignitary, or a dirty little secret. They didn't allow her to enter stores without clearing them of civilians and non-essential staff first. It was all a bit surreal. Once they made it to the bathhouse, she was ordered to strip so they could take her armor to be cleaned. Searched would have been a more accurate term, but there was little point in protesting. The consent dogma, which was central to the national philosophy, was paper-thin. In so many circumstances, compliance was mandatory. She was gradually learning to manipulate that system. For example, she informed the bathhouse workers that she considered squeezing her black tail to be implied consent to be stung them with it. The bath was pleasant, but made her miss Synthola more. By the time she returned to her confinement area, the roof had been opened, her sword and dagger had been relocated, the room had been cleaned and reorganized, and her dark, empty stones had been stolen. Naturally, nobody admitted to having seen them. Shinji. The console beeped. Shinji's eyelids felt heavy. He'd gone a day without water. Only a half-ration pack remained. He was getting lightheaded and dizzy. The carbon scrubbers mustn't be cleaning the air properly anymore. The cockpit was getting cold. It was just a matter of time until life support failed completely. Alone. He was going to die out here. The console beeped. It was a terrible way to die: starvation, thirst, and eventually frozen. Maybe he'd be found someday. The ID chip in his wrist would be the only evidence of who he was once, the wreckage of the ship the only evidence he ever existed. The console beeped. Then again, he could collide with some object, or burn up into some random star, or the uncaring atmosphere without anyone ever knowing he was there. What had he really done with his life? Would the only impact he ever made be colliding with some rock one day? The console beeped. The thing that stung the deepest was the knowledge that the last thing he'd ever hear wouldn't be the bittersweet words of a loved one at his side trying to console him. No, it would be that infernal noise mocking him in death. The console beeped. He heard a new noise, and a tremor passed through the escape craft. Had he hit something? Was his fate to be recycled by some trash barge? The sound seemed muted, his vision blurred, and everything went dark.